Well, hello everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Carl Knightley, and I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit this afternoon. And this session is about engaging older people and mobilising church. So hopefully you're in the right room. And we're going to be thinking about, in the midst of this pandemic we're in, how do we reach people digitally, through social media, online, and any way we can actually, in these times where often older people are away from us behind their doors and not involved in church online necessarily. So just to make sure that you know you're going to get what you're going to get, we're going to be thinking about how we view older people. I think that's really important as we think about what our why is. We need to know our why before we think through our how. And then we're going to be thinking about how we engage with older church members in the virtual world. And then finally, how we can mobilise church to reach older people. So hopefully that's clear. My day-to-day job is leading Faith and Later Life. Faith and Later Life is a Christian charity that is focused on older people. The clue's in the title. And we exist to encourage and equip Christians to do three things: to reach, serve, and empower older people in every community. We want to think through and encourage churches in how they serve and empower their older members, and also how we reach older people in the wider community who might not know Jesus as Lord. And of course, he might be very lonely in these current times. So, as I said, I just wanted to start with thinking about how we view older people. Just at this point, just to say, please do be thinking about any questions you might have. Put them in the chat box in the Q&A, and then we'll make sure we answer them, or as many of them as possible at the end. Hopefully that's okay. So how do we view older people? I think some of this might be obvious, it might be clear to us, but I just wanted to just to think about it anyway, because of course we need to think about how God views older people, because that should be our starting point, of course. And God designed old age, and that's something which we really need to remember, against a societal narrative that perhaps sometimes thinks that when you're older, you're over the hill, or it's an inconvenience being old, and old is associated with illness and other sorts of negative things. So that's the first thing, and we'll be thinking about that a little bit more shortly, that God designed old age, and that should be our starting point. And of course, we'll probably all be aware of the impact of loneliness and isolation on older people. And I'm sure we'd all agree that loneliness is not okay. In fact, loneliness is debilitating and as bad for you as 15 cigarettes a day. So the statistics tell us. And then the last thing I wanted us to reflect on as we think about how we view older people is that we serve older people, and that's the right thing to do as Christians. We serve our older Christians around us, but we also receive much from older people. So hopefully this session will be reflecting a little bit on some of those biases that we might have around our view of older people, perhaps those unconscious biases. We serve older people, but we also receive much from older people. So this is my one and only slide in this session with Bible verses on. I don't like cherry picking Bible verses, and there are tons and tons, but I just wanted to share these. Just firstly, thinking about the fact that we know God designed old age. Old age isn't an accident. And if we dip into the Bible, we'll see people like Abraham and Moses and Aaron and many others being commissioned for the first time in their older age, and Anna and Simeon and others doing great things and playing a big part in the Bible story in old age. And at Faith and Later Life, one of our favourite scriptures is that one there, Psalm 92, about older Christians flourishing and still bearing fruit in old age. We want all older people to flourish, knowing Jesus, and of course ultimately bearing fruit in old age, because old age is a blessing from God. And so I just wanted to get that out of there, because I thought that's really important as a firm foundation around why we do what we want to do. And then of course there's a societal context. As we look around us, as I mentioned earlier, loneliness is a huge and devastating problem for all ages, of course, but certainly for older people particularly. At this point, it's worth just saying that older people, and when we think about older people, we're thinking about those who are 65 plus. Of course, old age is not a homogenous group. There are different people with different health situations, abilities, desires, plans, whatever it might be. They might look very different. My mum is in her late 60s. I'm not sure she'd want to be described as an old person, but she's very different from my friend Betty, who's 100, who I'll tell you a little bit about later. But nevertheless, there are almost 12 million older people in the UK. And of those 11.9 million, over 5 million older people say that the TV or their pet is their closest form of contact, their main company. Over 5 million people rely on the TV or their pet for their main companionship. And I think we should just pause and think about that. When we're thinking about digital and online and those sorts of things, and we'll press into this a little bit later, but just reflecting on that stat there, that says 41% of older people feel out of touch with the pace of modern life. That's something we need to reflect on when we're thinking about how we can reach older people in these current circumstances. And just to say that these figures are all taken from Age UK research, if you want to go away and Google them. So again, that's just some more scene setting, which I think is really helpful, because we need to think about why we do what we want to do, why we want to reach older people, and how we view drives what we do. That's something that I think is really important, because we often think that older people are all, I would say, quite similar. Maybe, there are lots of people who think older people are just grumpy, basically. And of course, there are older people who are grumpy, but they were probably grumpy when they were younger. Older people aren't all, let's say, rich Brexiteers, and older people aren't all people who don't go digital. There are so many benefits from community and the experience and wisdom and maturity, particularly of those older Christians in our midst. And of course, older people have a unique perspective that comes with living for many years. And so those are just some things that I think it's useful to think about and reflect on as we move forward. So how do we engage with our older church members? The first thing there, I think we need to think about when we're thinking about in the midst of church being scattered rather than gathered, is that we mustn't make digital assumptions. You'll see on the screen this lady, and that's my friend Betty, who I just mentioned, and she's 100. And up until January last year, she was an active member of the church. And then she broke her leg and had to go into domiciliary care, and then ended up staying in a care home, which is where she is now since COVID struck. And the reason I wanted to tell you about Betty is that even though Betty, if you walked past her, you might dismiss her subconsciously. She's bent over double. She doesn't really hear very well, but she's a wonderful praying lady, a real prayer warrior who's up at 5:30 every morning praying. And whenever I need any prayer support, she will always pray for me, and we communicate via iPad. She's very proficient on her iPad, and it's a lifeline for her. Actually, she sends emails to and fro, and so we mustn't make digital assumptions, because she's 100 and she's a real whiz on her iPad. So there are many older people who do engage digitally, and I think that's really exciting and something that we need to think about. But of course, there are those who don't as well. And so gentle encouragement is really important as we're thinking about how we can reach older people, and particularly how we can engage within the church, because there will be many people like Betty, believe it or not, who are digital, but there will be many of our church family and friends who perhaps aren't. And that's why gentle encouragement can go a long way. My mother is somebody who is, she'll go online to send an email, but she doesn't have a Facebook account. She doesn't really do anything online beyond sort of sending emails. She doesn't like internet banking, anything like that. So when COVID arrived and she couldn't come over and see us and see her grandchildren anymore, we had a problem, and we had to think about how we fixed that problem, and equally with church and her church and going online. And so we sat down together at a distance, and over a couple of hours, I taught her how to Zoom, and that took some time, and we got there. And so I think something just to think about, actually, when we're seeking to engage with older people in our church who might at first glance not be able to join us online, is that we just need to be patient. I think it's really important, certainly in my context and from the work we do with Faith and Later Life, it's very clear to see that often older people will default to thinking that they're a burden, particularly if they're the older age group within the older cohort. Those in their 80s and over than that, they'll think they're a burden and they won't want fuss. And so it's really important to encourage those older people so they know that they're not a burden, that they matter, and we want them to be part of church, whatever it might look like in our local context. So can we encourage someone to learn to Zoom, or even just a video chat on WhatsApp? How can we encourage them to do those sorts of things? Because there are loads of innovative tech solutions, but we can also keep things simple, with WhatsApp and Zoom and other things. And I wanted to just share a little bit about Facebook, because Facebook is a really powerful tool. And anecdotally, people would say that the kids are all doing other things now, and Facebook has grown older in its demographic, if you like. And of course, those people who are on Facebook when they were 40 10 years ago are now 50, and equally those who were 50 10 years ago are obviously now 60. So people will be on Facebook who are older. And Facebook can be a powerful tool for staying in touch with our older church members who might be comfortable doing that, but still might not necessarily feel confident going to an online church service particularly. Early on within Faith and Later Life, when we set up our organisation, which is web-based, we set up a Facebook group, and it had 27 followers on Facebook, and that was about 6 months in. And then I joined Faith and Later Life and gave it some digital energy, shall we say, and grew it. And just around 2 years later, we've got over 2,000 Facebook followers, and many of those are older people. I had a Facebook message from an old chap who was housebound, and just said he felt so encouraged by the Bible verses we'd share on Facebook and that sort of thing. So Facebook is a key engagement tool. And so actually it might be that in your church, you have a church Facebook group, or there might be a local Facebook group that you can use to either encourage older church members to get involved with, or just invite them onto Facebook and say, look, this is a safe space for you. And that could be that jumping on point where you could then encourage them more onto digital church. And this is really important because we know, as I said from the previous slide, we know older people are lonely, and we know society is fragmented, particularly in these pandemic times. So it's really important for us to think about how we can reach older people, and that must start with our own church community, starting at home, if you like, before we then go away. And as we think about home, I'm sure a vast majority of us, certainly many of us, will be working from home at the moment. And so I wanted us just to think about, as we seek to engage with older people in our church digitally, who might not be online and dialing into the Zoom service or Zoom coffee after church. We need to serve those older people and engage with them and find any solution we can, innovative, tech, more basic. But something that's really important is we mustn't just engage with those older people because we think they need help, because we can benefit from their help too. As I mentioned earlier, wisdom, serving as church elders, life experience, a listening ear, prayer warriors, those older folk in your church are valuable and are precious, not just to God, but to the church fabric, I would say. And if your older folk in church aren't Zooming, or maybe they've fallen off the radar, have a think about how church might be missing something without them, and maybe how they can work from home, as well as checking in on them just to see if they're okay. Because everybody is useful, and critically, everybody wants to feel useful. And it's really important for us just to ensure that we're engaging together as a church family. That must be the first step. And actually, let me take us back a slide, because let's think about this a little bit more. Because when you have those older people who might not be online with you within your church family and are feeling like they're a little bit lost, that's a really important point at where we seek to mobilise internally before we then mobilise church in the wider community. And there are those older people like Betty, who are very old, who might not be able to do lots of things actively. They might not necessarily be church elders. They might not be able to offer practical advice on lots of things, but they have that wisdom and they have that desire to really fervently pray. But then there are also those younger those older folk in their 70s, for example, who might have been at home shielding or whatever it might be, and very frustrated because prior to that they were very active. At my church, the majority of the pastoral team, because they had certain health conditions or of a certain age, had to shield certainly early on in the pandemic, and that was a real loss, not just to them but to us as a church, because we needed our pastoral team to go out and help the so-called older people. There are so many older people in our church and in many churches within our Faith and Native Life Church network who say, well, we're involved with volunteering because we like to help the old people, and they're saying that being in their 70s and even in their 80s themselves. So it's really important that we engage together as a church family, that we stop to think about the value and the benefits of older people within our church, and not just press ahead, just sort of doing the best we can, serving those people who are digitally savvy, if you like, and not the others. Because I think in this, certainly the circumstances we're in now, in this pandemic world, there'll be many people in our church who are away, who aren't dialing in, who aren't zooming in, who will be afraid and feel isolated. And of course, beyond our church walls, metaphorically, there'll be many older people who are fearful because they don't have the hope that we have as Christians. And I think as an older person, in human terms, with less time left than the rest of us, that must be quite fearful indeed if they don't know the love of Christ. So we must mobilize as church. The first step, as I've said, is to really think about how we engage within church, because we can't be hypocritical. We can't forget about the older people in our midst and then seek to go out and reach older people outside of our church, as it were. We must mobilize as church. And this needs to be important to us as individuals, as well as a church group. We need to want to reach older people, and we need to strive to reach older people any way we can. And that means digital, but it also means not digital. And as I was reflecting earlier, I was preparing for this session, I was trying to think, what does virtual mean? What does digital mean? Because if you're someone who's regularly Zooming and doing all sorts of other things, we might have this idea of what digital is and what virtual is. But I think, if we're not there in person, that can mean lots of things. It can mean online, it can mean social media, it can mean Zoom, but it can also mean things like the phone and the radio, those crazy old tools, which have undergone a renaissance. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. And the reason I mention the not digital bit, if you like, is that according to the Office for National Statistics, in 2019, there were 2.5 million people aged 75 plus who'd never used the internet. 2.5 million people aged 75 plus who'd never used the internet. Now that figure has probably improved slightly since COVID arrived, because people like my mum have taught themselves how to use Zoom, and there will be those, of course, she had used the internet, but I'm sure there'll be some who hadn't and have since ventured tentatively perhaps into that world, or maybe embraced it fully. But I can't imagine that all 2.5 million people have done. So it's really important that we think about all the various ways we can reach older people and mobilize church. When we do think about mobilizing church, as I mentioned earlier, we can think about those pre-existing Facebook groups and other community groups. We don't need to start afresh, if you like. But what we do need to do is start by valuing the older people in your church. And of course, by the fact you're on this call means I'm sure you do value those older people. And there are many churches doing really good work. In this picture here, Pippa Kramer, she's the seniors minister at Holy Trinity Claygate. And they had a connections weekly group for older people that used to have over 100 older people attending. And so they really value older people in their church. And since lockdown and everything, she's been doing a sterling job with her team, going out to deliver hampers and cards to people at a safe distance from their homes and phoning them. And it's really important by valuing the older people in your church, because then that sends that message outwards that older people are important. And so what does it mean to value older people? Well, it means we're intentional about outreach as well as inreach. And we all have strategies, and I'll talk about strategy a little bit later. but we all have strategies about what it looks like to value particular areas. And many churches have strategies around evangelism more broadly, but that tends to end up looking like a bit more of a younger cohort. And we always want to ensure that we're attracting young families and ensuring that we have got youth policies and youth pastors and all that sort of thing. And so if we're going to take reaching older people seriously, I think we need to be intentional about that. And I'll talk more about that wider church-wide picture a little bit later. But I think it's important that we start by encouraging each church member to engage with older people on their street and in their local context. And at the beginning, towards the beginning of the first lockdown, coming on for over a year ago now, for almost a year ago now, in March, April, I leafleted my road, which is a cul-de-sac, so it's not a huge road, but I've sent leaflets around with my kids just to say, look, we live at number 1. And if you're older and you need any help, you know, with shopping or prescriptions or just a phone call, just to have a chat, then give us a call. Left our mobile number and our landline, because often those old people feel more comfortable with landlines. And so we were trying to engage locally in our street and model that. And it had only been 10 minutes since we got in the door before the phone rang for the first time with an older person phoning up just to thank us for the leaflet that we popped through, saying that it was good to know that somebody was there in case they needed anything. So it's really important to have a desire to do this individually, and then the more people at your church you have that desire, then hopefully that vision can filter upwards if it's not already a priority for those church leaders. And at Faith and Nature Life, we have a church champion community where folk who are involved with ministry with older people, or who just have a heart for this area across the UK, have joined us and joined our free community, and then we support them, encourage them, and as we seek to prioritise older people in our churches. And you can look on the Faith and Nature Life website, faithandnaturelife.org, if that's interesting for you. I don't know if you've heard about the Daily Hope free telephone line. I said earlier that the phone is undergoing a renaissance, and it really has. When we think about reaching older people, particularly those older people who either aren't online at all or who are reticent when it comes to joining Zoom or doing other things like that and YouTube, the phone has been a real lifeline for so many older people. And you saw Pippa Kramer in that last picture, and Pippa and her team at Holy Trinity Claygate, along with Faith and Nature Life and the Church of England, came together and we set up the Daily Hope telephone line in April last year as a COVID response, knowing that there are so many older people who are going to be isolated and lonely. And of course, this wasn't just for older people, because there'll be other people who are feeling lonely and isolated, but it was predominantly aimed at older people. And the idea is that you can phone up the Daily Hope phone line, and then you have a series of options that you're presented with. You can then press those various options to hear either reflections or prayers or hymns just on loop if you don't want to hear a sermon, or you can listen to a weekly service. So this was a real lifeline, and we had so many letters pouring in. And I say letters because obviously the majority of these people using this weren't online. Handwritten letters from some folks saying, you know, we've not had any engagement with our church at all. You know, we're in a rural context, for example, and we've just had no support. And this isn't me being critical. This is just some letters we received. But yeah, those people, older people, were saying they really valued having the Daily Hope telephone line. So we've been able to go out to church leaders and say, look, you know, it's really hard for you. I can't imagine how difficult it is trying to juggle everything, all the pastoral work, doing all the Zoom stuff. And if you're finding it difficult engaging with older people in your congregation, obviously, you know, please do what you can. But if you're struggling, then do at the very least pick up the phone and share the Daily Hope telephone line with them. And since that launched at the end of April last year, it's received over 350,000 phone calls, totaling over 4.2 million minutes. And so it's been very popular. People are phoning and they're phoning again. And it's 24 hours a day, and it's free to UK landlines and mobiles, which is really exciting. And I'll share the phone number with it at the end. But it's 0800 804 8044. And you can just Google the Daily Hope telephone line if you want to know a bit more about that, or head to the Faith and Later Life website. And I mentioned strategy earlier, the reason I mentioned that, and I'm revisiting it now, is I think it's just really important to emphasize that if we want to reach older people, and particularly mobilise church, we need a plan. We need an idea, and that helps us, focusing on exactly how we can best use our resources, because churches, like any organisation or even people, individual people, don't usually do something without a plan, without a strategy, or even just without a to-do list. As churches, we as a church family, individuals within a church, we need to be bought in. I think we need to be all committed to the goal if we want to reach older people, because obviously we're more effective when we travel together. So it's good to plan our resources. Having a phone rotor, it sounds like such a simple thing, doesn't sound very technical, but actually if we're just phoning up those older people in our church and checking on them, that can just be really powerful. I've heard so many older people saying, just knowing they're not forgotten is really, really important. Again, virtual lunch clubs, something you might not have thought about. So many good lunch clubs and coffee groups. Is there a way we can make those things virtual and provide a really simple solution for churches? Or even if it's a home group on the phone, let's plan these things out. It aids intentionality, but also it's just stopping and pausing, because a lot of this stuff isn't really, really, really difficult. It just requires us to stop and think. And as per that last point there on this slide, it's helpful because it just causes us to take stock. Is this important to us as a church? Because church is at its best when it's intergenerational, I would suggest. If you think about mums and tots groups, when my wife, when our kids were very, very small as babies, she'd go to a mum's home group. And of course, that couldn't work without the older ladies who are operating the creche. As I just mentioned, our church is heavy on the older people in the pastoral work, eldership, PCCs if you're in an Anglican church, welcome teams, kitchen, cakes and coffee. We remove one cog, that older person, that older group, and the engine can fall apart, or at the very least stutter. The body of Christ needs all its parts. And away from church, society needs granny and granddad back. I don't know if you know that older people contribute £6.6 billion to the economy in terms of childcare, and that's from data that's over 5 years old now, actually, out of a grand total of £61 billion. So older people make a difference in fiscal terms, although we shouldn't measure people in terms of what they can do. But I would be really grateful if my mum could be hands-on with my kids again. But until that time comes, let's not forget about our older people. Let's continue making sure they know that they're valuable and they're not a hindrance or a burden. And so I mentioned some resources earlier, the Daily Hope telephone line. And if you go onto the Faith and Later Life website and just type in Daily Hope or go to our resource hub, you can print off printable posters with the Daily Hope phone line that you could then stick up in your window even, or post through doors if you wanted to. And we've got other guidance just to help prompt churches and church leaders in thinking about how to engage with older people, because it's just really, really important. It's a bit of a joke when I used to go out to do visits at churches and with groups, because I'd walk in and people would think I was carrying the bags for the old boy who was then going to come and present, who was in charge of Faith and Later Life. And as a vaguely younger person, it's so important that whatever our age, we understand the importance of all ages of society, and particularly the value of having those older people in our midst. And also understanding that loneliness is debilitating, for those older people, particularly at Christmas. This Christmas was the loneliest Christmas, according to Age UK. 1.7 million older people were expected to be on their own on Christmas Day, which was double the amount of last year. And so this is important. This is happening now, and we might have a vaccine being administered and on the way, and there might be light at the end of the tunnel, but it's still a very difficult time with with rather gloomy weather outside as well. So this is a time where church needs to come together. This is a call to action. Let's get our own house in order first, church-wise, but then let's go out to our wider community, either as individuals or as church groups, because historically, whenever there's been a crisis, church has jumped into the gap. So what greater opportunity do we have than to show what it looks like to be church in action, to be the hands and feet of Jesus, particularly with older people at a time when older people are being disproportionately affected by COVID in terms of the restrictions of their liberty, because they don't want to go out because they might be afraid or they might be unwell, but also in terms of the grief, the loss of losing loved ones to COVID, or worrying about their own health. So what do we do now? And bearing in mind this session is around loneliness, is around mobilising church and engaging older people when it comes to digital and social. What do we do now? My contention was that we need to think digitally and socially in terms of social network, but we also need to think about there's non-digital solutions too. You see this fabulous stock photo of a chap excited at receiving packages, and so many of our church champions over Christmas were delivering little packages like this to older people in their churches, but also in the wider community who had links with the church, and church Christmas postcards. We had a not forgotten Christmas campaign where we sent out through our church champions and supporters thousands of postcards to older people, just saying, look, you're there, we see you, you're not forgotten. So what can we do as individuals and as a church? We can make a commitment right now to saying to ourselves, this is important. And as I said, I'm sure it's important to you already because you're on this call, or you might be watching this later. But if it's already important to you, who can we share this with? Who can we say, look, this is important to in our church? Or who can we just check in with at church in terms of our leaders to say, look, I'm sure you've got this covered, but has anybody got a list of all of the older people in our church who live alone? Who can you call today? Who can you call this evening? Maybe just to see how they're doing, maybe just to ask them for help or something else as you engage with your older church family and friends. And who in your older church family and friends that you already know can you encourage to try WhatsApp or to try Zoom or something like that, or just to create a Facebook account and see how they're getting on? And as I said a few slides ago, who can you share the Daily Hope telephone line with? Maybe by leafleting your street, just if it's somebody that you don't know. If it is somebody you do know, who you can pick up the phone to and say, look, have you heard about the Daily Hope telephone line? Give it a go. There's no one talking to you. That might be an attraction because you can just listen and hang up whenever you like. We always have to think about safeguarding, obviously. And in our church context, you would need to make sure that you're slotting into any church regulations around safeguarding. And if you're doing something on your own, I would suggest we're not going into people's houses at the moment anyway. So there's less risk around that. But just obviously make sure that you're being sensible. But I can't see what could be a problem with dropping a leaflet into someone's door just to say that we're here. Because as I said, I did that on my street, and there was a really positive response. Who can we share the Daily Hope telephone line with? And most importantly, even if it's just 5 people, we can think about older people in our street, in our family, even an older aunt, and in our congregation, who we can maybe just stick on the fridge and commit to praying for, as well as phoning. And we don't need to feel guilty about this sort of stuff, that we might not have done it before. We don't need to feel guilty if we didn't phone them one week, but let's just try to get into a rhythm. Who can we phone, even if it's just once every 2 weeks? And if we're church leaders, who can we encourage within our church? Because of course, this can't just be about church leaders. And something which is really exciting, I think for me, is thinking about how we can engage with care homes, because care homes have been affected obviously really badly with COVID. Do you have a local care home where you can just pick up the phone and say to the care home staff, to the manager, are there any older people in your care home who might value a letter or a postcard or a drawing from my kids, my grandkids, even me? It's just about stopping and thinking. And then when you do that, it's amazing what comes forth and what you can do, and actually how profound the smallest little thing can be. You'll never know the impact that you can have actually until you try something really small. So I'm sure if you're already doing this, you might, you already know this stuff, but if you're thinking about it for the first time, or if you need any more support in it, then do have a look at our website, and you've got all of our details there on socials, Twitter, Faith and Later Life on Facebook, and you can send us an email at info@faithandlaterlife.org as well. Do pray, not just praying for, please pray for us and our work, we'd value that, but do pray for those older people, pray for your church leaders, pray for your community, and talk about this stuff, because the more we talk about stuff, the more it happens. The more we're intentional about things, the more things happen. And join our Church Champion community if you'd like to. It's free. There's no quid pro quo. We'd love to provide you with some more support and strategic thinking, if we can, about how we can do this stuff and how we can work together, because there are already some really wonderful organisations. And I'm just looking at the chat here, such as Anna Chaplin's Bible Reading Fellowship, who are doing really great work. And actually, this Guidance for Christian Faith Organisations document that we produced with Professor Keith Brown, who was based at Bournemouth University. I know that Anna Chaplin's have been using that a lot, and Faith and Later Life is part of a wider network called Christians Together Against Loneliness, group of organisations, and the Bible Reading Fellowship are part of those. And so they do some excellent work. And Care Home Friends are another really good Christian organisation, and they do some great stuff around working in care homes, linking lives, have some great befriending schemes. There are lots of support out there and information out there, so do get out and have a look if you haven't done so already. So I've whistled through that. I wanted to leave about 20 minutes for questions. It might be that we don't need that amount of time, but it's really important that we can really just get into this stuff if that's helpful. And so I'm just looking through the chat, and so we've just mentioned from Jan about Anna Chaplin's, and yes, some CV dioceses have an older person's rep, and because of our work with the Daily Hope telephone line, we've got more plugged into to the various dioceses. Faith and Later Life is an ecumenical Christian charity, so we're not denominational. We love to work with all denominations, but where there's reach, and we really want to make sure we can just kind of spread our mission really, and seek to encourage churches and individuals to reach, serve, and empower older people. And we love to speak at churches if we have an invitation these days by Zoom. We love to do that. So Jan has said, "You're right about care homes. I've contacted my local one of letters, phone calls, and even sent flowers." And that's just brilliant. It's just so important. Betty, my friend who's in a care home, our church looks after older folk, I think, pretty well, and so she's well looked after, and that's good. But equally, there will be those older people who just don't see anybody, particularly as care homes haven't been able to receive visitors, just to try to protect those older folk. So it really can't hurt just to contact them and say, look, is there anything that might be helpful? And with the Care Quality Commission, who regulate care homes, it's really important to them that people in care homes have faith-based activities. So I think you'll find that care homes will be really interested in hearing anything that you, probably more as a church, but nevertheless, even as an individual, can offer. And so Kathy says, any ideas or resources for how we can encourage our older congregations to share their faith with their friends and neighbours, when traditionally they're the people who didn't really talk about their faith, so they feel they're part of the ministry, outreach and care too. And that's absolutely crucial and so important. Thank you for raising them, because we don't just want to serve our older Christians, we want to empower them too. And it was only when Betty was brought up the front of church a couple of years ago in my church and interviewed as an unsung hero that I actually got to hear her testimony. And we'd love to see churches with older folk leading the prayer ministry, talking to the youth about what it looks like to follow Christ faithfully for 60 years. So when I talked about Pippa Kramer and her connections group at Holy Trinity Claygate earlier, what's quite interesting and maybe even unique, but certainly interesting about their group of 100 odd older people who used to attend in person, is that all the volunteers were older people. And so, you know, it's so important that we don't just sideline older people when we're doing Alpha, or when we're doing CAP, Christians Against Poverty work, whatever it might be, food banks, we do it together. That's why I wanted to start this session with thinking about how we engage with our older Christian brothers and sisters before we think about reaching outwards. We need to ensure that we are leveraging and empowering and using all the gifts and skills of our older members of our church, as well as everybody else. And I think when it comes to sharing faith with friends, there might be those older people who don't feel, you know, that they're comfortable doing that sort of thing. Typically, certainly there's old people who are very resilient, you know, just get on with it. And so they might not want to do something unless they're asked, which is why I said it's so important to ask, you know, older people for their advice, you know, to get involved, because they might not volunteer. But I think, you know, if you just ask those older people, you know, if they want to share their faith. And at the moment, I think what sharing faith looks like can be so simple in terms of, this is a frightening time for many people. But I know that Jesus is with me. You know, we don't have to be overly complicated about it. And it might be that those older people can share that with a friend, with another older friend over the phone. When we think about setting up a phone line within church to keep those older people connected, it might be that we can ask some of those older people to lead that phone line, that phone rota, if you like. And I think where there's real value in asking older people to be involved, certainly within church, is when you are from perhaps a younger family, you know, or, you know, you're trying to juggle a job and homeschool your kids and life is stressful. Having that encouragement or that listening ear from an older person who will have tons of time at the moment is really valuable. Just having an older person just to listen and maybe chip in their wisdom. Now, that's not sharing faith necessarily, as you say, Kathy, but we, you know, it's so important to encourage our older members of our congregation to do that. On our website, we have lots of blogs. We're hopefully sharing some helpful practical ideas about this and about a raft of things. And we have a resource hub. We want to be like a Google for churches around older people, if you like. So we've got lots of different resources on our website. So do have a look at our website, see what you think. Over 60% of what we have is free to download as well. And so that's faithandnaturelife.org, or just Google Faith and Nature Life. And actually, the benefit of these sorts of sessions, you know, virtually joining with people on this call and those who are watching this afterwards on demand, is we can all come together. What we want to do at Faith and Nature Life is share your best practice, learn from you. You know, if there are any gaps in what we can be doing, then, you know, somebody shares and we can then share that out across our networks with other people. So it's really helpful to be able to think about these things. And I'm grateful for all the input. I'm just scrolling down to see if anybody else has got anything else to say. I know that a lot of people are watching this later. And if you are watching this later and you have questions, and obviously I won't be able to answer them in real time, do send an email to info@faithandnaturelife.org if you have any questions. And I'll really be happy, me or one of my colleagues, to get back to you, either just to come and do a session or just answer your email questions that you might have, really. So in church, in our local community, on our road, and in care homes. And when we think about digital, I think the key takeaways are that there will be people who are doing digital, but are older, and let's not have disregarded them because we assume that they don't. So let's make sure within church we're checking in on all our older people, and it might be that they just need a little nudge into how they can log on, if you like, to that online service or access YouTube. It might just be a very simple step. And then there are those people who won't have done that sort of thing before. Maybe just getting on the phone with them and walking them through something, encouraging them gently, and if they don't want to, that's fine. But actually, we want to make it clear to people that we want to make time to involve them, because I think it would be very terrible if an older member of the congregation felt like they weren't a member of the congregation anymore, because everyone else had kind of just pressed ahead with online church and they weren't involved. And as I said, you know, we've seen, thousands and thousands of people join our Facebook group, which is focused on older people and with older people online, and they've really found that to be a benefit. So whether it's just tentative steps to Facebook or WhatsApp, then let's do that and see how we get on. And then, of course, those older people who we can't engage digitally at this point, how do we mobilise them? Well, let's make sure as churches, how do we engage with them? As churches, let's mobilise together. Let's know that this stuff is important, not just because God says it is, although that's the main reason, but because we have a loneliness epidemic that needs to get sorted out. We need to do what we can. And also because we benefit from older people. It's such a blessing to spend time with Betty when I went to see her for her socially distanced 100th birthday party, when I went to see her earlier on in September, just to catch up. It's a real benefit. So let's remember why we do these things, and let's use the Daily Hope free telephone line. Let's use just stopping at someone's front door, even if it's just waving through their window to them. Let's think about things about how we can engage with older people and reach those older people in the wider community who might not know the Lord or who might be lonely. And as church, let's be intentional about that. Let's write it down, because when we write it down, often we do it. That feels like a very whistle-stop tour. The good news is you will be able to access this afterwards. And if you can't, go to our website. I'll say it for the last time. It's faithandlaterlife.org. Or do join us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. We're all over the place. And actually, I'd love to connect with you as well, just to see if we can, connect with you in your church, either as part of our Church Champions Network, or just to give you any other answers or information that might be helpful. So I'm just going to scroll down for the last time, and I can't see anything else. So thank you for those of you who've dialed in. I'm just going to pause. And if anybody else wants to ask another question or share another reflection, they're welcome to do so. I'm not going to keep us on the call on this webinar just unnecessarily, and just to repeat everything I've said, because I've tried to summarize, and I hope it's been helpful. Thank you for your encouragement, Kathy and Jan, and Matt as well. I know you're there in the background. Why don't I just pray as we finish? Lord God, thank you for this time. Thank you for this conference. I thank you for the people who are watching this now and who'll watch later, who have a desire to bless those older people around them. Help us to be able to do as you would wish us to do, and help us to be able to have those tools at our disposal to do what we need to do, and just to remember that we have that hope as Christians, and we want those around us to know that there is hope beyond the vaccine even. And that older people need to know that they're never alone because you're with them. So bless those older people in our midst, Lord, and show us who we need to reach out to. In Jesus' name, amen. So thank you very much, everybody. It's been a pleasure to speak to you and with you. God bless you, and do get in touch.